The night in Guanajuato fell heavy and dense, as if the stars themselves had decided to hide behind storm clouds. The wind, with a humid touch, brought with it the smell of wet earth, while thunder rumbled in the distance, marking the arrival of a storm that, like Santiago's situation, could not be avoided. He, who was once a strong and determined man, now found himself trapped in the wheelchair that had condemned him to a life of helplessness. His muscles, once forged in the hard work of the fields, no longer responded, and his skin, once tanned by the relentless sun, now looked pale, almost sickly under the intermittent reflection of the lightning. Santiago stood motionless on the edge of the cliff. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks and the unfathomable abyss below was all that accompanied his loneliness. In front of him, Rodrigo Velasquez, his former partner and mentor in the world of finance, stood tall, like a shadow that seemed taller than he really was. The wind ruffled his dark hair, and his face showed a cold, distant calm. "You knew this was going to happen, Santiago," Rodrigo said with a cold smile, watching with some morbid curiosity as his former friend struggled to stand firm, even when his body betrayed him. Santiago did not look away. He knew what Rodrigo had done. The theft, the betrayal, the manipulation. In his mind, everything was clear. He was not just another victim of Rodrigo's power games, but a sacrificed piece on a board he had played and lost. With a single push, Rodrigo made the wheelchair overflow over the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to stop as Santiago fell, dragged down by darkness and pain. His body plunged into the abyss, and with a muffled cry that was drowned out by the rumble of nearby thunder, everything fell silent. Would you like me to continue with the detailed development of the next chapter? Or would you prefer that I review some of what I have written? A silent witness. The storm raged on, and the raindrops fell heavily, as if the sky itself were trying to extinguish the tragedy that had been unleashed. In the midst of the darkness, when everything seemed to be plunged into chaos, a pair of bright eyes watched from the shadows. Leon, Santiago's faithful German shepherd, had been by his side for years, and his loyalty knew no bounds. Even as the thunder and lightning thundered around him, he remained motionless, staring at the cliff with the same intensity as his master always had. Leon had been nearby when it all happened. He had seen the fatal push that condemned Santiago, and in his heart he had felt the same anger as his owner. Not only because the man he had served for so long was in danger, but because he knew that Santiago's life, once filled with purpose, was now in the hands of a traitorous man. With a stare into space, Leon waited, tense, until Santiago's figure finally disappeared into the darkness. For a couple of seconds, everything was silent. But only for a moment. Leon's desperation became palpable when he heard the muffled sound of his master's body hitting the rocks and the roar of the waves around him. The dog moved quickly. He was a trained animal, with instinct and knowledge of what he had to do. He leaped toward the cliff, searching for his owner with almost human precision. At first, he didn't see him, but his sense of smell guided him to the edge. There, between the rocks and the water, he found Santiago, unconscious and soaked. His breathing labored as if he were on the verge of death. Leon approached, moving his muzzle tenderly but also urgently. He began to lick Santiago's face, desperate to wake him up. The rain was beating down on his fur, but he didn't stop, repeating the gesture over and over again. Santiago, with his eyes closed, seemed to be trapped in a nightmare, but he slowly came to. A soft sigh escaped his lips, followed by a weak murmur. "Don't leave me here, Leon." Leon, hearing his master's voice, barked with a determination that only the most faithful animals know. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave him behind. No matter how much it cost him, he had to save him. With a superhuman effort, the dog began to pull on Santiago's jacket, dragging him to a safer place, away from the dangerous edge of the cliff. As he moved forward, the rain continued to fall without ceasing, but Leon did not falter. With each pull, he managed to move Santiago a few more centimeters towards a precarious shelter. The man was barely conscious, but pain and fatigue kept him clinging to life. Leon, guided only by his loyalty, never gave up hope. As time passed, the dog approached the base of the hill, where a blanket of vegetation could offer them some shelter. Leon's hope was simple: to keep Santiago alive long enough for someone to find him. In the midst of the storm, his only thought was one: to save his master. The rescue. The rain continued to fall furiously, as if the sky had decided to completely overflow. Leon, with his paws firmly buried in the mud, dragged Santiago towards a safer shelter, soaked to the bone but not losing hope. His snout constantly touched his master's face, making sure he was conscious, although life seemed to slowly slip away from him. Despite the difficulties, Leon did not stop. Time passed, and Santiago, almost unconscious, trusted his faithful companion. The only idea that was on his mind was to stay alive long enough to be able to take revenge on Rodrigo. His body was exhausted, and his mind struggled to stay awake, but the will to survive, to do justice, kept him anchored to life. After what seemed like an eternity, Leon reached the base of the hill. At that moment, Leon's barking caught someone's attention. A middle-aged man, with graying hair and a face weathered by years of working the land, suddenly appeared from the shadows. It was Don Esteban, the owner of a nearby hacienda, who, seeing the soaked and agitated dog, immediately realized that something serious had happened. "It's Santiago's dog," Don Esteban exclaimed, his voice filled with alarm. In the blink of an eye, he sprang into action, calling his wife Carmen while quickly gathering his men. Carmen, seeing Leon's condition and the exhaustion on his face, also understood the gravity of the situation. The old landowner wasted no time, and together with a few of his trusted men, headed toward the place where Leon had appeared with his master. The rain did not stop them from moving quickly, and soon they were mounted on horseback, oil lamps lighting their way through the darkness of the night. Leon, seeing the arrival of help, began to pant with relief. Although his body was tired, his mission was almost accomplished. With renewed determination, he led Don Esteban and his men to the place where he had left Santiago. The old landowner, without hesitation, bent down next to Santiago's body, who was still breathing weakly. "My God, he's alive," Carmen murmured, surprised and relieved. With great care, Don Esteban's men lifted Santiago, placing him on a horse. Despite the pain, Santiago barely whispered a few words. "Rodrigo, he has to pay." Santiago's voice was almost inaudible, but his words were clear to everyone present. Don Esteban, with his firm gaze, nodded with determination. "We will do it, Santiago. I promise you." As the group rode back to Don Esteban's estate, the storm continued to rage, but something in the air had changed. Santiago's fight was not over, and now he had people willing to help him confront Rodrigo. Justice, though still distant, was beginning to draw closer. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter? Rodrigo's deception. As Santiago struggled to stay alive, Rodrigo Velasquez, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, had already begun to plot his next move. In his mind, the betrayal was consummated, and with it, his plan was complete. After pushing his former partner into the abyss, he thought that everything had been resolved, that the weight of blame would fall only on Santiago. However, he did not count on Leon's cunning or the unwavering loyalty that the dog had shown. Rodrigo now sat in his mansion, a glass of wine in his hand, completely confident that the path to wealth and power was clear again. The rain was beating against the windows of his office, but he didn't even notice it. He was focused on his own plan, to present himself to the press as the sole heir to Santiago's fortune. He couldn't let his supposed disappearance be seen as an accident or a tragedy. No, he had to manipulate the narrative to make it all seem like a personal tragedy, an accidental fall into the abyss of despair of a broken man. After all, who would doubt his word? The next day, Rodrigo held a press conference. His face, impeccably groomed and with the false expression of regret, appeared before the media. He explained to them that, after a deep discussion between him and Santiago about financial matters, his old friend had accidentally fallen while they were walking near the cliff. As the only survivor and witness of the event, Rodrigo was visibly affected, but also strong, with the attitude of a man who had had no other option but to face the tragedy with fortitude. Santiago was going through a difficult time. It was a very difficult time, and even though I tried to help him, he couldn't bear it anymore, Rodrigo declared, staring into the cameras with a mixture of sadness and dignity. The press, as expected, fell for its version. Rodrigo's image as the loyal friend was reinforced, and very quickly, the rumors about Santiago's downfall became a sad anecdote. In a cunning way, Rodrigo also proclaimed himself to be the only legitimate heir to Santiago's fortune, assuring that all of the businessman's assets now became his property. However, not everyone believed his story. There was something in the way Rodrigo spoke that didn't sound entirely genuine. Some, more perceptive journalists began to ask uncomfortable questions, and soon doubts began to arise about the official version of events. A journalist from the newspaper El Horizonte found a piece of information that could crumble Rodrigo's story. It had been an accident, according to all the testimonies, but there was something that didn't fit. The security cameras in the area, located a short distance away, had not recorded the moment when Santiago had fallen. Without images, things couldn't be so clear. The journalist, with the idea of digging deeper into the matter, began to investigate the latest financial transactions of Santiago and Rodrigo, looking for some clue that could link Rodrigo to the disappearance of his partner. Meanwhile, Rodrigo didn't feel threatened. His security was at the same level as his ego, unperturbed. In his mind, he already had everything under control. But he knew that he couldn't stay still. He had to make sure that no one doubted his version. While he was busy with his own plans, he had to get rid of any trace that could link him to the supposed accident. Would you like me to continue developing the next chapter? Santiago survives. Darkness was the first sensation Santiago experienced when he woke up. His mind was clouded, his body aching. The cold breeze of dawn caressed his face, but what really made him open his eyes was the soft voice of Carmen, Don Esteban's wife, who spoke to him in a calm but concerned tone. Santiago, please wake up. You're safe now. He opened his eyes slowly. The vision was blurry, but he could make out the ceiling of a simple, cozy room. In some corner nearby, the crackling of a small fireplace filled the room with a comforting warmth. Where was he? What had happened? When he tried to move his body, pain invaded him. A stab of discomfort ran through his back and legs, and the memory of his fall hit him like a torrent. The cliff, the wheelchair flying over the edge, the emptiness, all of that came back to his mind in an instant. But at least he was alive. Don Esteban entered the room, followed by Leon, who, seeing his master awake, ran towards him and began to lick his hand effusively. Santiago smiled weakly at the sight of his faithful companion, but the pain was so intense that he couldn't help but close his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself. How? He managed to ask in a broken voice, looking around. How did I get here? Don Esteban, seeing that the man was still weak, sat down beside him cautiously, placing a hand on his shoulder with a mixture of concern and relief. We found you on the edge of the cliff, almost dead. It was Leon who guided us to you, Don Esteban said, in a serious tone but full of gratitude towards the dog. He took us here to the hacienda. You are safe, Santiago. Santiago nodded weakly, absorbing the words, but something inside him was beginning to boil. His mind, although troubled by confusion and pain, kept thinking about Rodrigo. The betrayal, the fall, everything he had lost. The image of his former partner's face, that cold smile, came back to him strongly. Rodrigo, he murmured, through clenched teeth, almost like a plea. Carmen, who had been watching silently from a corner of the room, approached with a glass of water, knowing what Santiago needed. She offered him the glass, and he accepted it with difficulty, drinking slowly, while his mind tried to understand the scope of what had happened. Rodrigo, he said now with more force, as if he were slowly regaining control of himself. He has to pay. Everything he stole from me. My life, my fortune. He can't keep that. I won't let him. Don Esteban nodded, recognizing the determination in Santiago's eyes, although he also saw the traces of the suffering he still carried. I know, he answered firmly, and I will help you in any way I can. Don't worry. Justice will be done, and he won't be able to escape. Santiago, despite the physical pain he still felt, began to think about his next move. His mind was gradually clearing. There was something inside him that told him that his fight was not over, or that Rodrigo still had to pay for what he had done. And if he was to take back what belonged to him, he would do it, no matter what it cost. With the support of Don Esteban and Leon, his closest allies at the time, he knew he had a chance. The battle was just beginning, and Santiago was not going to give up. At that moment, the man who had been pushed into the abyss, now with a new determination, knew he was rising stronger than before. Rodrigo's betrayal had not only destroyed his life, but it had also transformed him. He was now someone different, a man determined to take back his honor and what was rightfully his. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter? The beginning of the counterattack. Santiago spent the next few weeks at Don Esteban's hacienda slowly recovering. His wounds, though serious, began to heal, and his body gained some strength again. But what was really beginning to recover was his spirit. The fury of betrayal, the desire for justice, all of it had become a burning flame inside him. Rodrigo could have thrown him into the abyss, but he had not destroyed his will. With each passing day, it became clearer to him that his revenge was not just a matter of recovering what had been stolen from him, but of making his enemy pay for his crimes. During his convalescence, Santiago began to talk to Don Esteban about his plans, and it was then that he knew he was not alone in his fight. Don Esteban offered him his full support, and together they began to gather information. The landowner's loyalty was firm, and with him, Santiago had the wisdom of years of life in the countryside and a deep understanding of business. But what they really needed was evidence that could prove Rodrigo's corruption beyond a doubt. The missing key piece was Teresa, Santiago's former housekeeper at the hacienda. She had witnessed Rodrigo's dirty tricks, but as a woman who had lived in the shadows of power for years, she was not easy to convince. However, Santiago knew that she was his only hope of obtaining the evidence he needed to bring down his former partner. Felipe, Don Esteban's foreman, was in charge of locating Teresa. Santiago trusted him, as Felipe was not only loyal, but had the ability to move between towns without raising suspicion. Through some contacts, Felipe managed to find out that Teresa lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, a secluded place that had always been a refuge. One cloudy afternoon, Santiago, along with Felipe, headed to Teresa's house. Upon arriving, he felt invaded by a mixture of anxiety and hope. He knew that if he could convince Teresa to talk, he could get what he needed to bring down Rodrigo. When Teresa saw them arrive, her face showed a mixture of surprise and distrust. Although she was a woman who had spent much of her life in the service of others, her eyes reflected an intelligence and fear that could not be ignored. "What do you want, Santiago?" she asked in a shaky but firm voice. She knew that in her situation, the truth could be both a lifeline and a condemnation. Santiago, with a direct and sincere look, spoke to her bluntly. "I need to know the truth, Teresa. I know that you know Rodrigo's secrets, and I know that if you don't help me, he will get away with it. I ask you to tell me everything you know about his frauds." Teresa was silent for a moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but finally, after a long sigh, she spoke. "Rodrigo is not what he seems. He never was. I saw how he began to manipulate the finances of the hacienda, how he made shady deals with other businessmen. But I never said anything because I feared the consequences. He has contacts, people who will protect him. If you speak, he will not hesitate to destroy you, Santiago." Santiago looked at her with empathy, but also with determination. "I know, Teresa. But if I do nothing, Rodrigo will destroy more people, and I will not allow that. Help me, and together we can make the truth come to light." After a few tense minutes, Teresa nodded, and with a sigh of resignation, she began to relate what she knew. She had watched as Rodrigo falsified documents, made illegal deals with banks, and stole not only money, but land and property under his control. In addition, she revealed something even darker. Rodrigo had used Santiago's company to hide the profits from his illicit activities. Each of those secrets had a name, a date, and a signature. Hearing all this, Santiago understood the magnitude of Rodrigo's plan. He had not only stolen his fortune, he had destroyed lives. Santiago's fury grew, but so did his resolve. "Thank you, Teresa," he said, his voice deep and firm. "Don't worry. Justice will be done, and he will not get away with it." Infiltration. On a moonless night, Santiago and his team sneaked into the hacienda that was once their home. Following Teresa's directions, they found a safe hidden behind a painting. Inside were the documents proving Rodrigo's crimes. But before they could escape, Rodrigo and his men discovered them. The ambush. Rodrigo, gun in hand, smiled cruelly. "Look who came back from the dead." But before he could shoot, Leon jumped on him, biting his arm. In the chaos, Santiago and his allies managed to flee with the evidence in their possession. The chase. Rodrigo sent his hitmen after them. On horseback and with Leon guiding them, they managed to throw them off in the woods. Santiago knew he had to act fast before Rodrigo had a chance to cover his tracks. The truth comes out. With the help of Commander Alvarez, Santiago and Valeria Montes, his assistant, exposed Rodrigo in the media. Public opinion turned against him, and the police began to investigate his business dealings. The final showdown. Cornered, Rodrigo tried to flee, but Santiago and Alvarez confronted him. Eventually, the fallen businessman was arrested and his empire of corruption crumbled. A new beginning. With his home restored and justice served, Santiago decided to turn his ranch into an equestrian rehabilitation center for people with disabilities. Not only had he survived the betrayal, but he had found a new purpose. As he looked out over the horizon with Leon at his side, he knew that this time, his story was beginning again. Sure, I can go into more detail about each chapter. Let's start with the first one,